Rays of the One Heart, commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda and written by Swami Kriyananda. This week's title is, How Should We Meet Our Tests? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. Last week we considered Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness after his baptism by John. We discussed the question, does Satan exist? All of us experience temptation of one kind or another in our lives, some of us frequently, others only occasionally. Whether temptation comes to us from our own subconscious mind or from outside ourselves is secondary to the fact that it does come and that we must deal with it. More important then is the question how to deal with it. In fact, how to deal with tests of any kind. Martin Luther flung an ink pot at the devil who had appeared to test him. A dark stain on the wall of Luther's cell is pointed out to tourists to support this story. Unfortunately, our trials are not often so summarily dismissed. As a fellow monk once said to Swami Kriyananda, speaking of Satan, "If I could only get my hands on him." Jesus, during his temptation in the wilderness, overcame them, the temptations, and thereby set an example for all time by clinging the more determinedly to God. As Yogananda used to say, darkness cannot be driven out of a room with a stick. Once you turn on the light, however, the darkness will vanish as though it had never been. Jesus manifested this principle. The Bible tells us, therefore, that at last the devil leaveth him, and behold, angels came and ministered unto him. In the Bhagavad Gita, the point is clarified further by the added explanation that there are three qualities in human nature: sattvic, or spiritually elevating; rajasic, or ego-activating; and tamasic, or spiritually darkening. It is this triune aspect of human nature that is referred to in the Gita by these words. As fire is hidden by smoke, as a mirror is dulled by rust, and as an embryo is enclosed in the womb, so is the indwelling self enveloped by desire. Yogananda explained that each of these examples describes one of the qualities or gunas. Sattva guna, that which elevates our consciousness, can be freed of any identity of ego with a little puff of meditation and right affirmation, as fire is hidden by smoke. Rajoguna, which embroils the ego in restless activity, can be worked off with a little more and a little longer effort, as a mirror is cleaned of rust if it's a metal mirror. Tamoguna, embracing as it does such mental states as laziness and stupidity, can only be overcome in time, since it inhibits even the desire for self-improvement. So that's like the embryo has to gestate for a certain period. The example Jesus gave us was intended more for those in whom sattva guna is predominant. But if you yourself find elements in your consciousness that resist even the efforts to cling to God in prayer and meditation, don't despair. Patience, as it has been well said, is the fastest path to God. As long as your efforts take you steadfastly in the right direction, you will come out all right in time. Remember Yogananda's words, a saint is a sinner who never gave up. If, however, your nature impels you, even against your will, to move in the wrong direction, toward egoic desires and away from God, strive at least to detach yourself mentally from your wrong actions, which are induced by habit. The time will come when their own stored up energy will tire and diminish. At that time, if you have not contributed to that energy by your consenting will, you will find it possible at last to redirect your energies more constructively. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. We're here for the fire ceremony. You remember Dharmadas mentioning that some of the titles for these readings are just sort of begging for a little bit of a flippant answer. So we sometimes think of this one, how shall we meet our tests? Pleasantly. Next question. So that is definitely good advice. When Swami was still with us and he was growing older, he one time was lamenting when it was just the two of us about how he was losing his sense of hearing, his sense of taste, his sense of smell. It was all these senses were slowly disappearing. And then we started joking because he still had his sense of humor. And a sense of humor is very, very important on the spiritual path. Otherwise, it can get to be very grim. I remember one time a particularly heavy test was in my life. And I finally started thinking to myself, well, I'm paying off a lot of karma. I'm paying off a big chunk of my cosmic visa bill. And that helped me to think, well, I must be working off a lot of karma. There's a dear friend of ours who has been having some health challenges, and the doctor told him that he should exercise, he should go out for a run every day. And so he wrote to us and said, yeah, it's going well. I went for a run today, and I was only passed by an old man slowly walking his dog. And that is what enlivens us. That's what connects us to the divine. I can always tell when I'm going to get through something if I can feel cheerful. If I start making little jokes in my mind as time goes along, I know I'm on the right track. Can I have some water, please? Thank you. I was reading something interesting the other day that was saying that human beings can only see 0.0001% of the spectrum of light. And we can only hear 0.0001% of the spectrum of sound. Now, what that tells to me is that we don't have a lot of information. There's a lot going on in this world that we don't perceive. If we were to look at our hand under an electron microscope, we would not be able to tell, I haven't done this, but I've read about it, we would not be able to tell where we end and the universe begins. There's no clear barrier there. It is a flow. So think about that. We don't have all the information, and we have this illusion of separation. We think of ourselves as autonomous beings that are moving through the world, but we're not separate. It's just a flow from one person to the next, from one thing to the next. And we can't perceive this oneness because of the limitations of our senses. So if you think about what the meaning of life is and you relate it to these ideas of science, think about that. What does that mean? It means we're specifically here, in my opinion, it means this. We're specifically here to focus on a very small spectrum of information, and we are here to overcome this illusion. It is a delusion that we are separate. So we're here to develop, in a sense, an ego, a sense of self, and transcend it. We have to realize, as the Buddhist yogi said to the hot dog vendor, make me one with everything. That's what we're here to realize, that we are one with everything. Just like the Festival of Light says that we will do in a little while, we have to overcome selfishness, and we have to realize that we are part of all that is. So when we move through this world, Stephen Hawking said that it's an energy soup. You know, we don't see cosmic rays or X-rays or infrared or the vast spectrum of colors that birds can see and dogs can hear, the sounds that we can't hear, this energy soup. Realize that we are part of that. And when we pass from away, just like Swami losing all the senses one by one as he was ready to leave this world, we will leave this world someday. Everything that is born must die, and that which is dead must rise again, so the Gita tells us. But I often think that old age is a way of understanding bit by bit that everything we thought we had, everything we thought we were, was just on loan. It was never really ours. We were just tapping into a particular frequency of energy. Like we've talked about before, we just tune our radio of our consciousness where we want, and we have that choice. And we can tune it into fear and anger and hatred and all that sort of stuff, or we can tune it into light and joy and giving and selflessness and happiness. We have that choice. And what we have to do is rise above the static, really, of our own minds. And once we can rise above the level of just constant thinking and start to quiet the mind, then we can start to perceive in that stillness true happiness. The trouble, of course, is that things cause us pain, and and we have allergies, for example. So how do we deal with pain? Well, Sai Baba had a wonderful saying. He said, pleasure is an interval between two pains, and pain is an interval between two pleasures. So when we know that, we can start to become more even-minded, and we start to see that good things come and good things go. And bad things come and bad things go. Even if it seems like an eternity of bad things, they will go. This too shall pass. And so when you start to realize that it's just this continual roller coaster, up and down and up and down, good and bad and good and bad, you start to realize, I just need to stay even-minded. As Yogananda said, even-minded and cheerful. Knowing that the bad will go, and even the good will go, and more good will come into your life. The more you are even-minded. Because those roller coasters, high and low, attract more negativity. But calmness attracts more of itself. So this is a great secret. And we should know, too, that as the scriptures say, we are here in this Maya, this illusion of separation. We are here because God wanted to enjoy himself through many. I'm going to argue that with him when I see him next. But that's what the scriptures tell us. And even if you think you're not enjoying this very much, or are we having fun yet? No. But still, that was the reason. He wanted us to grow first in a sense of self and then transcending that self so that we would be more in tune with his consciousness. Yogananda was asked, where does it end? Where does this evolving spirituality end? And Yogananda says, you go on until you achieve endlessness. There is no end. There's only more and more joy.
This topic, as Nirmala mentioned, makes one think of sort of quick answers that don't tell a whole story, but answering the question, how should we meet our tests pleasantly? Well, another answer, because there's always more answers than just one to a question like that, by singing. And why would I say something like that? Because, I mean, just singing, I mean, you could, tunelessly whistling or whatever doesn't necessarily help you meet your test. But on another level, if you hear the spirit of Swamiji's music, so we sang earlier, The Secret of Laughter. The secret of laughter lies in the laughing, not in the search for joy. There's you could make a whole class series out of that one line of that one verse of the song. He's saying people strive for years trying to pay off that house, trying to get the kids ready for college, trying to, whatever it may be, whatever their whole, getting ready, building that retirement nest egg, whatever it may be. And all of it is sort of chasing after something that's outside, whereas what he's saying is we have to have joy now. It has to transcend. There's a different song that we sing often, the Song of the Nightingale, and the last line of that, last verse of that song is, joy must sing in the night to face change unafraid. And that singing in the night means even when the test is going on, even when it's challenging, even when it's difficult, it's like we have to have that awareness of the divine within. I had an interesting example of this. Swamiji gave us, collectively us, I suppose maybe some of us were here. I think Nirmala was present at the time. The scene was, Swamiji was giving a class, I want to say circa 1983, 1984, at Ananda Village. And it was a summertime class, outdoors, and the chairs were arranged on the hill. It's a different location. It's actually the location of where the beautiful Temple of Light is now, the structure. At the time it was called the Temple of Trees. And so all these chairs arranged, there was a dais built, a plywood dais, or a little smaller than the size that we have here. But on that dais was a smaller little pedestal on which his chair sat. And unbeknownst to any of us, the chair had worked its way back to the last inch of the dais. So he came bouncing up onto the stage with a lot of energy, and he sat down in the chair and promptly went right off the back. And he, without missing a beat, like a gymnast, did a somersault and came right up on his feet. And I mean, it was the kind of maneuver that if you had low blood pressure would just about make you pass out, because I mean, you go over and you pop right back up and suddenly you're standing there. And he just sort of, shook his head a little bit, pushed the chair a little more forward and sat down on the chair and gave a wonderful class. And, this gasp went up, when his chair went off the back. I mean, you could imagine, it's a little shocking. And I, who was responsible for the little dais thing and the position of the chair on it, was even more mortified. He was fine. I mean, he would prefer that it not happen again, and we ensured that it didn't happen again by putting a large piece of wood in the back so the chair had something to run into. But that spirit of being able to respond in that way is built across years and decades of positive thinking, of affirmation, of meditation, of a 24/7 approach to the spiritual life. Not a Sunday morning for an hour and we put on our happy face. It's not just a put-up job, as Yogananda would say. It has to grow organically from inside, and then it can handle a scenario like that. So I'll give another example from my own life of the sort of longer rhythms of this. And this happened in 1980. I was very new on the path, and as you can imagine, if you do the math, a little younger than I am now. And Seva, who has now left the body in the last year, was one of the sort of pivotal people at Ananda Village at the time, and she had a unique role. She was in charge of the nuns, the women monastics, but she kind of had seniority over all of the monastics, including the monks. And it's not that we would see her for personal counseling, but more kind of organizational counseling. If we were planning to take a new job or shift to a different center or something like that, we would just check in with her. It was a respect and also a kind of way of getting her guidance. But one fine day, I had been at Ananda for about a year. She asked me to come and see her, and I had been doing construction work, and I was supporting myself. I was doing okay, living in a little structure with the monks. But she said, "I think you should go to the rice harvest." And the rice harvest, happens every fall. And at the time, it was one of the ways that otherwise young and basically unskilled workers could go and get work for 6 or 8 weeks. And the work, the pay was minimal, relatively speaking, but because there were so many hours, the work was 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for the period of time. So you got in some hours. So even if it was only $5 or $6 an hour, added up across all this, and the fact that you basically couldn't really spend any money while you're doing that meant that it added up into some real money at the end. So I and a whole bunch of guys went down to Oroville to try to get on the rice harvest. And I remember thinking to myself, her guidance to me was, you need to put out some energy. Now, it's not that I wasn't. I was doing my work. I was adequately serving in my way, doing construction work. But I thought, she said it. It's a good idea, I'm going to assume it's a good idea, whether I know it or I don't. And let me do this. So I went. Well, that year, the rice harvest was sort of inundated with people who had already done the rice harvest in other years, which meant that they got hired first, and they really weren't hiring people who were not experienced. So if you had worked around the equipment, if you had driven one of the tractors, or if you were skilled in some kind of way, you got on at the rice harvest, and if you weren't, you didn't. And I was one of the didn'ts. So I had to kind of scramble around, and one of the scramblings I remember colorfully was picking prune plums from a tree and putting them in one of these bins that, I tell you, it was, it seemed like it was like 6 feet square, but it was probably only 4 or 5 feet square. But it stood about yay high, and I remember the gang of us got $20 to fill one of those things. Well, it took us the better part of a day to fill the darn thing. And the guy, it was hopeless. We were hopeless. We were moving. We were working hard. You climb a ladder, you pick a bunch of prunes, you throw them in the thing, you get them off the ground, you throw them in the thing. It's back-breaking work. And we figured out that we were making about $1 an hour, killing ourselves out there in the baking hot sun of Chico, Oroville. Anyway, that was not happening. So I ended up getting a job at the bottling factory in Chico, the juice bottling factory. And I made a minimal wage. And the interesting part of it is that if you tallied it all up at the end, I actually came home with $150 less than I went to the rice harvest with. So from an outward standpoint, it was a net loss. And if you had sort of just taken a freeze frame photo right in that moment, a little selfie photo, and said, okay, rice harvest equals didn't really work out, you would have said, oh, well, the guidance, I guess, wasn't so great, was it? No, the guidance was actually terrific. It was just terrific in the longer rhythm. Because I came back to Ananda, I immediately landed a better job, making more money and putting out more energy. And the rice harvest led to that, even if it wasn't, breadcrumbs leading from one to the other sort of obviously. There was an energetic component to it. We have to learn to flow. That was a word that Nirmala mentioned several times. It's a flow. And we have to get in tune with that flow. If you're going to windsurf on the river, you have to get into the flow of the wind the current of the river. You have to figure out where the sail is. And, I act like I know what I'm talking about. I know nothing about what I'm talking about. I know a little bit about sailing. But you have to work with the energies. If there is no wind blowing, you're not going to have much of a flow. Windsurfing, I'm just speculating, but I kind of think that's true. But life itself is full of waves. Life itself is full of movement, and we have to learn to maneuver in that in such a way that we remember who we are. We remember that the divine is moving through us. And this is something that Swamiji never lost sight of. And I was reminded of this by a very dear friend who has been through long, got on the path in the early 70s, been through all sorts of changes, all sorts of, dramas in life. But I will always remember something that he said, and it's a guiding principle of his life, and it's a guiding principle of our lives if we will tune into it. The test is not about the score that you get. It's about the consciousness that you get. In other words, what we become. There's a beautiful line that we sometimes quote from Sister Gyanamata. The things that happen to us do not matter. Now, if you just did a freeze frame there and you say, the things that happen to us do not matter, they jolly well do matter. Yeah, they matter a lot. But what she's saying is, the next line is the conclusion. What we become through them does matter. So, in the context of life, the broad life, in the moment, something wonderful, something disastrous, something whatever happens to us, that's not the important thing. That was going to happen anyway. What we become through that is a result of choice, is a result of pranayam, is a result of consistent application of spirituality in our lives. That's the key point. And when we have that principle active in our lives, then there's nothing that we cannot achieve.